Today we're going to talk about the main commissions of interactive brokers. And here I'm referring to the main commissions. We're going to go to the Interactive Brokers website, and here there's a section called pricing, which in fact we'll talk more about later on. And here we can see the commissions directly, as well as margin types, interest rates, short selling costs, and several other things, including the fees. So today, this video is the start of a comprehensive playlist I have planned for the future, in which we'll discuss all the various fees and commissions of interactive brokers. But today we're going to begin by talking about stocks and ETFs, which are what most people primarily use to invest. As for investing in options, futures, and so on, we'll cover those in other videos when we talk about their specific commissions. So let me know which one you want me to cover first after this video, or if you'd prefer that we talk directly about the fees. Now, once we're here, honestly, what I do is disable this translator from interactive brokers, because as you can see, I mean, literally, I don't know, this should be translated as fees directly, but I don't know, tarificación sounds a bit strange to me. I don't know if it sounds normal to you. So what am I going to do this time? This time I'm going to use a translator called DeepL, which is basically this one here that I open, and it simply translates things for me in an easier and simpler way. And what are we going to translate? You might be wondering. Well, basically some words, some phrases to understand things much better. But anyway, once we are here, as I mentioned, we are going to have all these investment options available, each of which comes with different fees and commissions. Now, to understand a bit more before we dive directly into the whole topic of fees, we need to talk about, in quotes, two memberships, so to speak, that exist within interactive brokers. I call them memberships, but don't take that literally. I say this just to give it some kind of name. We could even call them categories, which might make it clearer. For example, the first category would be Interactive Brokers Live. With this one, we won't be charged for stock purchases, whereas with Interactive Brokers Pro, which is the other category, we will be charged. But what's the difference between these two? The main difference is that Live is only available to people who are residents of the United States. And also, this is primarily for individual retail investors, not specifically for people who handle exceptionally large volumes or make very significant investments. If interactive brokers were to detect that someone is making very large investments, they would obviously ask those people to switch to Interactive Brokers Pro. But as I mentioned, with this particular one, we do have that specific requirement of being a legal resident of the United States. So for the purposes of this video, we are going to primarily focus on Interactive Brokers Pro, because I assume that most of the people watching this video don't necessarily have US residency. Alright, so now let's get into talking about the various commissions, specifically as I mentioned earlier for stocks and ETFs in this particular case. So first of all, here we have the different places where we can invest our capital. Within Interactive Brokers, we have comprehensive access to various stock exchanges all around the entire world. The primary one, quite obviously, is the United States, but as you can clearly see here, for example, within North America, we also have both Canada and Mexico.
However, if we go up here, we can easily enter the European region and look at all the various investment options we have available within Europe, as you can clearly see here.
In this particular case, I am mainly going to explain the detailed table for the United States. But to be completely honest, if you fully understand the comprehensive table for the United States, you can literally understand all the others, because they are all quite similar in their structure. Some of them are even much easier in comparison, like Mexico's, for example, because certain specific commission rules don't apply, which inherently makes the calculation simpler. And in Europe, it's more of the same situation as you can observe here, except that we'd be dealing with euros in the specific case of Europe. So, well, that's that. And then we'd also have Asia, as you can see here. But anyway, my friends, once we've fully understood this point, let's now move on, as I previously said, to explaining the detailed table for the United States. In this particular case, the first thing we have to consider is precisely why we are going to be charged. Well, quite obviously, we are going to be charged for our investments, and these investments will be measured in shares, that is to say, in stocks, which is exactly what you see depicted here. So what happens, depending on the exact number of shares we currently have in a particular trade, that is to say, in a purchase or a sale transaction, a specific commission will be applied, as you can clearly see here on the right side. And that's primarily because in interactive brokers, we specifically have two distinct types of categories within the Pro category, the tiered category and the fixed category, which is this particular one right here. So once we fully understand this crucial point, these numerical values that prominently appear here on the left side clearly indicate the precise number of shares we are actively purchasing in a single transaction. So as you can see, in this particular case, for less than or equal to 300,000 shares, they will charge us 0.0035, and we will go into this in much more depth very shortly. However, before we move on and proceed further, I want us to focus on something truly important. As you can clearly see here, where we observe the monthly volume, we have two distinct numbers, specifically 1 and 7, and down here we have other significant numbers, 4 and 8. These particular numbers basically serve as a crucial guide for us so we can understand these more easily and comprehensively. How do we find these numbers? We simply scroll down, and here you'll find an option called Disclosures, and here what we can do is read everything that appears according to the number. So once you understand that, I recommend you come and read this carefully. Now let's scroll back up here and understand the following. First, we absolutely need to keep in mind the most important thing of all, which is the minimum per order and the maximum per order. This is crucial because thanks to this we'll be able to figure out precisely how much it will cost us to make a purchase or a sale. So let's start with the tiered system to understand exactly how it works, and we'll use a stock as a clear example. This stock will be NU, this one right here, which is currently at $6.85. Let's go back here to Interactive Brokers and do the following. We're going to do the calculation using both the tiered commission and the 1%, both in the tiered system, that is the one based on level sum with the fixed one. But before we get into that, you're probably wondering, what do you mean by 1% and by commission? Isn't it just a single commission and that's it? Well, to understand this, let's dive deeper into something important, which I mentioned earlier: the minimum and maximum per order. The minimum amount we will be charged when executing a buy or sell order for stocks is, in the tiered system, 35 cents, 0.35 USD, and in the fixed system, it's $1, 1 USD. However, there are certain asterisks here that we need to look at, because it says that the maximum they can charge us is 1% of the trade value, and that's where the difference comes in. When I talk about tiered commissions, I'm referring to this particular one, meaning these commissions right here. When I mentioned the 1% levels, I'm referring to this specific one over here. And don't worry if you haven't understood up to this point, we're gonna move on to point 8, which is over here, so we can understand it better. Let's scroll down and read what appears here. Let's copy it, translate it, and leave it here on the right. Alright, now let's go back to the commission system so we can understand it. It says that if the maximum calculated per order is less than the minimum per order, and maybe this is where you're starting to get confused, but don't worry because we're going to go through it point by point. It says if the maximum calculated per order, that is, the maximum calculated per order would be this one here, 1% of the trade. In other words, doing it in this particular way. If this specific value here, the maximum amount allowed per order, is actually less than the established minimum per order, in other words, if 1% of the total investment value ultimately comes out to be less than 0.35, then it clearly states that the maximum per order will indeed be charged. So it would certainly make more sense to charge this particular one here, which is the 1% of the overall trade value. Here they give us an example. However, later on we'll do another one, and it says, for example, a purchase to acquire 10 shares at a price of $0.2 each, that is, 20 cents per share, will be charged $0.02. Meaning the 10 shares at the value shown here. Well, this is calculating using the fixed category, let's say, and it tells us that in the end we would have to pay $0.02. But if we calculated it this way with the $0.005, we would actually have to pay $0.05. But since 1%, that is, taking 1% from here is less, because it equals $0.02 compared to the $0.05 that would be charged here, in reality, they would charge us the 1%. We'll understand this very soon. Don't worry, there are examples of this absolutely everywhere. But anyway, another super important thing to keep in mind before we get to the main example is that, remember, there are other types of commissions or fees that we might be charged here. And in the specific case of the fixed fee, there aren't any at all. At this point, many of you might be wondering, well, which one is better for me? Honestly, that really depends on each and every one of you. Personally, I typically use and generally prefer the tiered one, but in some specific cases, the fixed fee structure works out better. However, the vast majority of people tend to use the tiered option. Although, something very important to note, when you first register your account with Interactive Brokers, what you'll initially get is this particular level, the fixed category. you'll be charged this specific fee here no matter what. Alright, so now let's do the example I mentioned with the NU stock. So let's open this up here. Let's also open the calculator, and I think by showing an example you'll understand it better. So let's say here that the NU stock is currently priced at 6.85, right? Now let's do it using the tiered structure. So with the tiered structure, how would you first calculate the commission? That is what's here, this part right here. So for example, if I'm going to buy 50 shares, that would be, let's see how much that is, 6.85 times $50, sorry, 50 shares, that would be 342.5. This would be the amount in dollars that I'd be spending to buy NU shares. So up to this point, everything's fine. Now, how do we do the calculation since I'm going to buy 50 shares? Well, what I'm going to do is when it comes to commission levels, I'm going to pay attention to how many shares I'm buying. Is it less than 300,000 or equal to 300,000, between 300,000 and 1 and 3 million, or what amount? Maybe you're thinking, no, but that's way too much. I'm never gonna make any kind of transaction with that many shares, but remember that there are those so-called penny stocks, which are shares with a very, very low price, and since their price is so incredibly low, it's very easy to end up buying or selling this many shares. So let's carefully set the commission levels, right? So in this case, you calculate the number of shares, which would be 50, multiplied by the commission they would charge me, which in this case, since it's less than 300,000, would be 0.00035. So it would be 0.00035, and I just hit enter and it tells me it's 0.017. So let's put this over here. Although honestly, when it comes out like this, it usually rounds up a little bit and ultimately ends up being exactly 0.18. Now, let's carefully place the 1% levels right over here. The 1% is calculated by taking the total amount I'm going to invest, which is 342.5. So I take 342.5 and then calculate 1% of that. Basically, I multiply it by 0.01 and that gives me 3.42. So what happens here? I'm gonna add another item here called commission. So what happens here? First of all, we're definitely not following rule number 8, which we saw earlier, which truly said that if this value was actually less than this one, then they would indeed charge me this one. But that doesn't mean that just because this value is higher, they're going to charge me this one over here. No, that's not what it means. But what it does mean is that, look here, because there are times when neither of the two rules applies. And as you can see here, this value here is very high. So rule number 8 that they give us here wouldn't apply. And this value here is very low. Why? Because the minimum per order is 0.35, which is what they should be charging me. So what happens then? In this case, they're not going to charge me 0.18, nor are they going to charge me 3.42. They're going to charge me 0.35, which is actually what's appropriate because it's the minimum per order. In fact, further down, they have some examples. But now, let's move on to the fixed rate so we can understand that as well. With the fixed rate, it's pretty much the same, only the values change a bit. And again, for the commission, it's 50 shares that we are going to multiply by the fixed rate, which is 0.005, which ultimately equals 0.25. So that would be 25 cents. And then the fixed value is practically the same because here we see that since it's 3.42 and is 1% and is the same amount as the purchase I'm gonna make, it ends up being the same. But here, something else entirely happens, and that is that since the minimum commission in this specific case is $1, in theory they should indeed charge me $1. Why is that? Because this commission over here is not less than the commission over there, so what they would end up charging me here is $1. So $1 here with the tier system, they charge me 35 cents. Under this regulation, the tier system would be more worthwhile in terms of commission. That doesn't mean it's like this in 100% of cases, so keep that very much in mind. Once we understand this, we need to scroll down and look at other types of fees they charge us. Or, well, not directly interactive brokers, but entities like the SEC or FINRA. I could explain this in other videos because honestly it requires more depth, and here it would take us about 2 hours. So we're gonna set this aside for now, commissions on ETFs as well, but I want us to look here at some specific examples it gives us. So when we come here, we can fully understand everything because it tells us here, let's go from the bottom up, and by doing this calculation, if you've already understood, I invite you to pause the video and then do the calculation based on what you've learned to see if you get exactly the same result as what's shown here. Because here it tells us that if we buy 1,000 shares at 0.25, the commission would be 2.50. So based on what you've understood up to this point, do the calculation, pause the video, and if you get 2.50, that means you've learned and understood it. But anyway, in this case, we're gonna do it ourselves. So what can we do first? Let's calculate it both ways. The first is the commission. And remember that here we're using examples from the fixed model, that is the model that charges us 0.005 no matter how many shares we buy. So keeping that in mind, let's come back here and do the first calculation, right? So since it's 1,000 shares, meaning it's less than 300,000, and in the fixed model there's only one commission anyway, we're going to multiply this by 0.005, and this gives us $5. So here we say, but why does it say 2.50 here? Well, because this commission model doesn't apply here, since in this case the 1% is less than the commission per commission, if you will. And here, if we're gonna do the calculation, we have to multiply 0.25, which is the price of each share, by 1,000, and this gives us the total amount we would be investing. And if we multiply this by 0.01, which is to calculate 1%, it would be $2.5. That is to say, rule number 8 would apply here, which you can go back and read, where it says that in the case where 1% is less than the minimum commission, blah blah blah, that's what they would charge us. So up to this point, everything is fine. I think most people will have trouble with this first one here, because that's where some confusion arises. And now let's move on to the second one. Now it's 1,000 shares at $25 each. So how does it work? 1,000 shares, which is what we're buying again, times 0.005. So the commission is supposed to be $5, and here it comes out exactly right. Why? Because here the other rule doesn't apply, which is the 1% rule. If we multiply 25 shares, no, not 25. It wouldn't be 25, but rather 1,000 shares times $25. That would be $25,000 that we would be investing. And if we were to take just 1% of this substantial amount, we would quickly realize that 1% would indeed be $250, which means the resulting fee would be truly exorbitant. That's why a $5 commission is applied right here. Now let's go to the first one, which causes the most headaches. Honestly, when I was trying to understand this, it was really complicated. To be honest, for those thinking about investing here, think it through carefully, consider if you really want to invest here. Honestly, it's a very good broker, it has access to many exchanges, it offers a lot of things, but at the same time, it's kind of complicated to fully understand all of this. And besides that, these aren't the only fees. We have to talk about others later on. So, well, I don't know, let's keep going here. Let's calculate this, and this is 100 shares at $25. So let's go with the first example. 100 shares multiplied by the commission, which is 0.005. We hit enter and it tells us that's 50 cents. So you might say, but here they're charging me $1. What happened? All right, let's clear this, and now let's do it the other way, which is 100 shares at $25 each, which comes out to $2,500. We take 1% of that, and that gives us $25. And here they're not charging me 50 cents or $25. And why does this happen? Because this value here, the 1%, is not less than this one. So point number 8 would no longer make sense. And besides that, the value calculated using this base here, with this base of 0.05, is less than this base here. So what happens is that they would take the minimum per order and end up charging me $1 from what I would be investing. And that's how it works here. Obviously, you can see the same thing in Canada. Here, they apply different rules. Always read the fine print that appears here. Go and look for them, because different things apply. But in general, most of the tables that appear here, for example, let's specifically go to Europe, we'll notice that in a country like, like Germany, it operates in a very similar fashion, but what fundamentally changes is the precise number of shares, as you can clearly see here. Here we're already talking about 50 million practically. We're dealing with different percentages. We're no longer talking about specific amounts, so that's basically what changes. But in the end, the overall calculation is quite similar and very easy to perform if you already fully understand the previous comprehensive table. So, well, friends, I hope you understood this. Honestly, it's still quite hard for me to fully understand this particular table, but I finally managed to grasp it completely. Now, of course, there's still everything else to explain in detail, like the various taxes, the different commissions, and so on. These important topics also need to be thoroughly covered. So with that said, I'll see you next time, and if you made it to this point in the video, leave a notebook emoji in the comments section, because I hope you wrote down everything I told you. So see you next time. Bye bye.